I was stationed in Belarus in late 1944, when the Eastern Front had already turned against us, and every day carried a heaviness that was impossible to escape. We lived in a strange mix of exhaustion and alertness, where sleep never truly came and silence often felt more dangerous than gunfire. I was 21, assigned to a small reconnaissance group, and our orders were simple: patrol the forests near the village, watch for partisan activity, and report anything unusual. But the night I am about to recall had nothing to do with partisans or the war. It had to do with something far older and far more terrifying than anything a man could do to another. The forest in that region was dense, endless, and smothered in mist that rolled in at dusk and never seemed to lift. The villagers we encountered avoided talking about it directly, but they always crossed themselves when asked about the ruins deeper in the woods. My comrades joked that these peasants were backward, too superstitious to be taken seriously. But when you spend night after night surrounded by nothing but dark trees and strange noises, their fears begin to feel contagious. One evening I was sent out on patrol with two others, Weber and Kraus. We followed a narrow deer path through the pines, the fog curling between the trunks and muting the sound of our boots. At some point, Kraus insisted he heard voices in the distance, chanting low and steady. Weber laughed it off, saying it was probably the wind. But the more we walked, the more convinced I became that Kraus wasn't imagining things. There was something rhythmic, something human in the sound, though muffled as if carried through layers of mist. After an hour, the path forked, and Weber suggested splitting up briefly to cover more ground before meeting back. Against my better judgment, I agreed, moving alone down a side trail while the other two disappeared into the fog. The silence quickly became oppressive, every crunch of my boots echoing unnaturally loud. The mist grew thicker, curling like smoke around the trees, until I could barely see more than a few steps ahead. And then I saw it, an outline in the fog, tall and angular, not a tree but a structure. As I approached, my heart began to pound. It was a chapel, or what remained of one. The roof had partially collapsed, and the walls were blackened by fire, though the forest had begun to reclaim it. Ivy twisting through shattered windows. The heavy wooden door hung crookedly, and carved above it was a weathered cross. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct telling me to turn back, but something stronger compelled me forward. Inside, the air was colder, almost damp, and the smell of old ash lingered. The altar still stood, though the crucifix above it had burned, leaving only charred wood in the vague shape of a cross. And that's when I saw him. A figure stood before the altar, motionless, cloaked in a tattered priest's robe that hung in shreds. His head was bowed, as though in prayer. I froze. My first thought was that he was a villager, some hermit who had taken refuge here. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. There was something unnatural about the way he stood, too rigid, too still, like a statue rather than a man. I forced myself to take a cautious step forward, and as my boots scraped the floor, the figure stirred. Slowly and possibly slowly, he raised his head. What I saw is something I can never forget. His face was not a face. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched thin across bone. Where the eyes should have been were only hollow sockets, black and empty, yet I felt them fix on me with undeniable weight. His mouth hung slightly open, and as it did, it stretched wider, wider than humanly possible, until it seemed to split his face. And then came the sound, a whisper, low and guttural, in a language I did not know. It filled the chapel, echoing off the burned walls, seeping into my skull. I stumbled backward, my body trembling with a cold I had never felt before. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure began to move, one slow step toward me, then another. His robes dragged across the floor, though I could swear I never heard them touch the ground. The whispering grew louder, overlapping, like dozens of voices pouring from his gaping mouth, that finally broke me. I turned and bolted from the chapel, crashing into the mist outside. The forest swallowed me, but the whispers followed. They weren't coming from behind anymore. They were around me, circling as though the fog itself had taken on his voice. I sprinted blindly, branches whipping my face, lungs burning, until I stumbled back onto the main path. There was no sign of Weber or Kraus. For a moment I thought I had escaped, but then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees, keeping pace with me. No matter how fast I ran, it was always there, just beyond clear sight. I don't know how long I fled through those woods, but the sky began to pale, with the first hint of dawn when I finally stumbled into camp. Collapsing before the sentry post, my comrades thought I had gone mad. They laughed when I tried to explain, though the laughter faded when Weber and Kraus never returned. Search parties were sent, but they found nothing, not even footprints beyond a certain point in the forest. The chapel, when I tried to lead them there later, was gone. The path I had taken ended in thickets and marsh. I never spoke of it again during the war. How could I? A soldier claiming he saw a faceless priest in a burned chapel, whispering in tongues, would be taken for a coward or insane. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, in the quietest moments of night, I hear that whisper again, faint and low, reminding me that I did not imagine it. The war took many lives, but there are things in those forests older than war, things that feed on fear, and wanderers who stray too far from the safety of others. And I will carry that sight, the hollow eyes, the splitting mouth, the whispers that chased me through the fog, until the day I die. I still remember the damp chill that clung to my uniform that night in Blackwood Forest. It has been decades, but even now, whenever I close my eyes, I can hear the crunch of wet leaves under our boots and the low hum of the wind through the crooked trees. Most people think soldiers only remember the gunfire and the battles. For me, the memories that have stayed are the ones I cannot explain. The moments when war blurred into something older, darker, and far less human. It was the winter of 1943, and my unit had been stationed near a small village at the edge of Blackwood. We had been ordered to patrol the forest perimeter after reports of resistance fighters moving through the area. Blackwood was not a large forest by any means, but it had a reputation among locals. They called it cursed, a place where hunters vanished and where children were told never to wander. I was not a superstitious man, but even I had noticed how quickly the light seemed to fade under its canopy, and how the air felt heavier there, as if the trees themselves leaned closer to listen. There were 4 of us on patrol that night. Myself, Weber, a sharp-tongued Bavarian who never stopped complaining, Richter, who was younger than the rest of us and too eager to prove himself, and Vogel, our corporal, a stern man who treated every shadow as a possible ambush. We moved in silence, our rifles slung over our shoulders, boots sinking into the wet earth. The snow had melted into slush earlier that week, leaving the ground soft and treacherous. We walked for what felt like hours, finding nothing but the occasional broken branch or footprint half dissolved in the mud. I remember how uneasy Richter looked. He kept glancing over his shoulder, flinching whenever an owl hooted in the distance. At first, Vogel scolded him, telling him to stay sharp, but even he grew quieter as the forest closed around us. It was Weber who first noticed the smell. "Do you smell that?" he muttered, wrinkling his nose. It was faint at first, a sour metallic odor that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We thought perhaps it was a dead animal, but as we moved deeper, it grew stronger, sharper, like rust and decay. We followed the scent until we came upon a clearing I had never seen before, a wide circle of blackened earth surrounded by crooked trees. In the middle of the clearing stood what looked like a ruined stone structure, little more than crumbling walls covered in moss and ivy. The air was colder there, unnaturally so, and I could see my breath plume in front of me, even though the night was not freezing. Vogel motioned for silence as we stepped into the clearing. The ground was littered with bones, small ones mostly, perhaps from animals, though some looked disturbingly human. Richter bent down to pick one up, but Vogel barked at him to leave it. I could see the boy's hand trembling as he dropped it back to the ground, and then we heard it. At first it was so faint I thought it was just the wind, but soon it became clear, the sound of children laughing, high and shrill. echoing through the trees. The four of us froze. There were no villages nearby, no reason for children to be in the forest at this hour. The laughter circled us, sometimes close, sometimes far, as though whatever made the sound was moving quickly around us. Weber cursed under his breath, gripping his rifle tighter. "Show yourself," Vogel shouted into the dark. His voice was swallowed almost immediately, as if the forest itself absorbed it. The laughter stopped, silence pressed in around us, and then, from the ruined stone structure, we saw movement. A figure stepped into the clearing. It was small, about the height of a child, but its proportions were wrong. Its arms were too long, its head slightly too large. It stood there, watching us, though I could not see its face in the darkness. My mouth went dry. Richter muttered a prayer under his breath. Vogel raised his rifle and ordered it to stop, but before he could fire, the figure darted back into the ruins, impossibly fast, almost like it had melted into the shadows. That was when the laughter started again, louder this time, overlapping voices, dozens of them, all around us. Some sounded right behind us, yet when we turned, there was nothing there. Panic began to set in. Weber shouted that we should leave, that no patrol was worth this, but Vogel insisted we hold our ground. His voice shook though, and I could tell he was as terrified as the rest of us. The air grew colder still, and I swear the trees themselves seemed to bend inward, their branches creaking like bones. Then came the whispering. It was soft at first, like leaves rustling, but soon it grew distinct. Words in a language I did not recognize, whispered directly into my ear, though no one stood beside me. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing. The voices crawled inside my head, filling me with dread, unlike anything I had ever felt on the battlefield. Suddenly, Richter screamed. We spun around to see him on the ground, thrashing as though something unseen had grabbed him. His face was pale, his eyes rolled back, foam bubbling at his lips. Vogel and I rushed to his side, trying to pull him up, but it was like he was being held down by invisible hands. The laughter rose again, shrill and mocking, and for a moment I thought I saw pale shapes moving between the trees, darting just out of sight. Finally, Richter went still. His chest heaved, his eyes wide with terror, but he could move again. "We have to go," he whispered, his voice raw. "We can't stay here." None of us argued. Vogel barked an order to retreat, and we stumbled back into the forest, the laughter following us, echoing through the trees until it faded into the night. When we returned to camp, none of us spoke of what had happened. Vogel reported nothing unusual, saying only that the patrol had been uneventful, but I could see the truth in his eyes. Weber refused to go near Blackwood again, even when ordered. Richter grew quiet and withdrawn, barely speaking to anyone until he was transferred weeks later. As for me, I still dream of that clearing. Sometimes I wake in the night, certain I can hear children laughing outside my window. I do not know what we saw that night in Blackwood Forest. Perhaps it was some trick of the mind, brought on by fear and exhaustion. But I have fought in battles. I have seen men torn apart by artillery, and nothing, not even war itself, has haunted me the way that patrol did. If you ever find yourself near Blackwood, and you hear the sound of children laughing in the dark, do not follow it. Turn back, and never look over your shoulder. I served in the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front during the winter of 1942. And though I saw battles and atrocities enough to haunt any man, the thing that still keeps me awake at night happened far from the front lines. When our unit was ordered to guard a supply depot in a small railway town outside Smolensk, it was the kind of place that did not even appear on most maps. A handful of houses, a church, and the railway station. The Soviets had abandoned it when they retreated, but no civilians had returned. When we arrived, the town was already half ruined. The station's roof collapsed from shelling, and the streets littered with snowdrifts and broken glass. We were 20 men assigned to keep watch over crates of ammunition and fuel until transport could be arranged. At first, it seemed like a relief compared to the front. There was no constant bombardment, no ambushes in the woods, only the empty silence of winter. But the silence itself became our enemy. It was unnatural, too complete, as though the land had been drained of all sound. Even the dogs that usually haunted ruined towns were nowhere to be found. We set up camp inside the station building, barricading the doors with planks. The men were tired, glad to rest in one place. But within days they grew restless. Some said they felt as if they were being watched. At night, when the fires burned low, several swore they heard trains passing through the station, steel wheels clattering over frozen tracks, whistles cutting the air. But when we rushed outside, the rails were bare, the snow undisturbed. One evening, while on watch, I saw lights in the distance, the faint glow of lanterns swaying in the dark, moving along the railway line. At first I thought it might be a patrol or stragglers from another unit, but as the figures drew closer, I saw they carried no rifles, no proper equipment. Their clothes were ragged, more like civilians than soldiers. I hailed them, but they gave no answer. When I shouted again, the lights winked out one by one, swallowed by the darkness. My comrade on duty swore the tracks beneath them had never been touched. The men grew afraid of the railway after that. None would stand watch near it. We began hearing voices through the night, murmurs in Russian, sometimes laughter, sometimes weeping. The strangest part was that the voices came from below, as if rising from under the earth. When we searched, we discovered an old service tunnel beneath the station, its entrance half hidden by debris. I ordered it sealed, but by morning the boards had been torn away, though none of the men admitted to touching them. That was when discipline began to crumble. One man, Schultz, refused to sleep inside the station, claiming he saw faces staring down at him from the rafters. Another, a veteran named Kruger, started carving symbols into his rifle stock, muttering prayers in a dialect I did not recognize. At first, I thought it was just nerves, the strain of isolation, but then the disappearances began. The first was Otto, a quiet fellow who had been assigned to night watch. In the morning, his rifle was found leaning against the wall, but he was gone. No tracks in the snow, no sign of struggle. We searched the entire town, even the forest edge, but there was nothing. A few nights later, 2 more men vanished, their posts empty, their weapons untouched. Some swore they heard the whistle of a train just before it happened, a long, mournful sound echoing through the night. By then, the men refused to stay in the station. We tried moving into one of the larger houses, but the voices followed us. I would wake to hear children crying just outside the window, though there were no footprints in the snow. Once I heard a woman's voice whisper my name in German, soft and pleading, though no woman had been within 100 kilometers of us in weeks. Sleep became impossible. We kept fires burning through the night, yet the shadows seemed thicker, pressing close. One night, Kruger, the veteran, snapped. He claimed he had seen a full train pulling into the station, black carriages lined with frost, though the rails were buried under snow. He insisted that men, thin, skeletal figures, had stepped off the carriages and were waiting for us. When the others laughed, he turned his rifle on them. We disarmed him before anyone was hurt, but the look in his eyes chilled me more than the winter ever could. He was not mad, he was terrified. The final night is burned into my memory. A storm rolled in, howling winds and heavy snow that swallowed the town. We were huddled in the house, the fire barely alive, when we heard it, the clear, shrill whistle of a train. It cut through the storm so close it made the glass rattle in the windows. My men froze, every one of them staring at me. Against my own better judgment, I stepped outside. Through the blizzard, I saw them, carriages standing on the tracks, black shapes rend with frost. Lanterns glowed faintly in the windows, and pale figures moved within. The whistle blew again, long and mournful, and the doors of the carriages opened with a hiss. Shapes began to step down onto the snow. They were tall and gaunt, their uniforms in tatters, some German, some Russian, all with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. They moved without sound, without breath, their faces pale as death. I stumbled back into the house, shouting for the men to prepare, but the door blew open before I could finish. The storm seemed to surge inside, carrying with it the stink of rot and rust. The men screamed, firing wildly into the dark, but I knew it was useless. The shapes filled the doorway, their mouths opening as if to speak, yet no sound came, only the whistle, shrill and endless, as though the world itself had become a train engine. I remember running. I do not recall how I survived, only that I awoke half buried in snow some miles from the town, my rifle gone, my ears ringing with that unholy whistle. When I was found by another unit, I told them the depot had been attacked by partisans. It was easier than the truth, easier than trying to explain why none of my men returned. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and sometimes, even now when the wind is high and the night is still, I hear that same whistle in the distance, and I wonder if it is coming for me at last. It was the winter of 1943 when I was stationed in the dense forests of Belarus. Our unit had been ordered to secure a small village that had been abandoned weeks earlier, allegedly after partisan activity made it unsafe for civilians. The Russians had melted back into the trees and the village itself lay in ruins. A few houses still stood, their roofs sagging under the weight of snow, but most of the buildings were charred skeletons of wood and stone. I was a Feldwebel then, tasked with leading a small group of men, and though I had already seen my share of blood and death on the Eastern Front, something about that place unsettled me in a way I could not explain at the time. The air was painfully cold, each breath burning my lungs, and the silence of the forest pressed down like a weight. We had expected to hear distant artillery or the pop of rifles echoing through the trees, but there was nothing, not even the cry of crows. The snow muffled everything, swallowing the sound of our boots and even the clink of our rifles. It was as if the world itself had grown tired of war and decided to hold its breath. When we arrived at the village, we set up quarters in what remained of the church. The roof was mostly intact, though a hole above the altar let in a shaft of pale light during the day. My men were glad for the shelter, even if the inside smelled of smoke and mold. Broken icons lay shattered on the floor, their painted faces staring up from the dirt as if accusing us. We built a fire in the corner, and though it gave warmth, it only deepened the shadows that crawled across the cracked walls. It was during our second night that the unease began to sharpen. One of my men, a young recruit named Weber, swore he heard whispering outside the church. We went out to check, rifles ready, but found nothing. The snow was untouched. No tracks leading to or from the building, and yet Weber insisted the voices had been clear, low muttering tones in a language he didn't understand. The others laughed it off, accusing him of being jumpy, but I noticed he kept glancing at the windows for the rest of the night. On the third evening, a heavy fog rolled in from the forest. It was so thick we could hardly see the other end of the street, and the village looked more like a graveyard than ever. That night, while most of the men slept, I was awakened by the sound of boots crunching in the snow outside. Thinking it might be partisans, I grabbed my rifle and quietly stepped to the doorway. Through the fog, I saw shapes moving between the houses, figures dressed in ragged winter coats slowly shuffling, their heads bowed. I raised my weapon, but as I watched, I realized something was wrong. Their movements were too slow, too deliberate, and none of them made a sound. I called for my men, and when they rushed out, the figures were gone, leaving only unbroken snow. That was when doubt began to eat at us. My men grew restless, snapping at one another, and the once welcomed fire in the church became a source of tension. The light seemed to carve the darkness into deeper, sharper shadows, and every creak of wood or gust of wind sent hands flying to rifles. Even I could not shake the sensation that we were being watched. It was not the usual fear of an ambush. I had felt that often enough. This was different. It felt as though something old and patient was waiting for us to make a mistake. A week passed, and our orders were to hold position until reinforcements arrived. Supplies were scarce, and the men had begun scavenging the ruined houses. It was during one of these searches that we found the cellar. Beneath a half-burned house at the edge of the village, a trapdoor led down into the earth. The air that drifted up was cold, stale, and carried the faint smell of rot. Against my better judgment, I ordered 2 men to go down with lanterns. They returned pale and shaken, saying the cellar was full of bones. Not just animal bones, but human ones, small, delicate skeletons that could only have been children. They lay piled in the corners as if tossed there without care. My men wanted to collapse the cellar, but I forbade it. We needed shelter, and besides, I did not want to draw attention by setting off explosives. Instead, I sealed the trapdoor and told them to forget what they had seen, but forgetting was impossible. That night, Weber woke screaming. He claimed he saw children standing at the foot of his cot, their faces hollow, their eyes black as coal. The others tried to calm him, but I could see the fear in their own expressions. One by one, they began reporting the same thing: shapes moving in the corners, whispers that faded when they tried to listen, the sound of small feet running across the floorboards, though no one was there. Even I began to hear it, a soft tapping as if fingers were drumming on the walls just beyond the reach of the firelight. Sleep became impossible. We took turns standing guard, but exhaustion made us careless. One morning we awoke to find the youngest of our unit, a boy barely 17, missing. His rifle lay neatly against the wall, but there were no tracks in the snow outside, no sign of struggle. It was as though he had simply dissolved into the night. Panic spread quickly after that. I tried to keep order, barking orders and threatening punishment, but inside I was just as rattled as the rest. By the 10th day, half my men were demanding to leave. They argued that partisans were the least of our worries, that the village was cursed. I almost agreed with them, but orders were orders and desertion was unthinkable. Still, I could not deny that something unnatural was gnawing at us. The nights grew longer, the fog thicker, and even the fire no longer brought warmth. I found myself staring at the broken icons in the church, wondering what prayers had once been offered there and why they had gone unanswered. Then came the night when everything unraveled. I was on watch, sitting near the doorway with my rifle across my knees, when I heard the sound of a child's laughter drifting through the fog. It was faint, almost playful, and it froze me where I sat. The laughter grew louder, circling the church, and soon my men were awake, clutching their weapons with wide, terrified eyes. Weber swore he saw a face pressed against the window, pale, thin, and grinning. We fired into the night, bullets tearing through the fog, but when the smoke cleared, there was nothing, only silence and the echo of our own panic. That was when the church door slammed shut of its own accord. The fire guttered, throwing the room into shadows, and the tapping began again, louder than ever, coming from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath us. My men shouted, some praying, others swearing, as the sound rose into a cacophony. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, as if dozens of hands were clawing to get inside. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. We sat there trembling until dawn finally broke. By morning, 2 more men were gone, their cots empty, rifles untouched. I searched the village, the forest, even the cellar, but found no trace of them. No blood, no tracks, nothing. My remaining men were on the edge of mutiny, and I could no longer think clearly. I sent a desperate message to command, begging for relief, but no reply came. It was as if we had been forgotten, left to rot in that forsaken place. The final straw came 2 nights later. I awoke to the sound of weeping inside the church. It was soft, almost delicate, and it seemed to come from the corner near the broken altar. Lantern in hand, I approached, and for a moment I swear I saw a figure crouched there, a small child, its face hidden in its hands. When I stepped closer, it lifted its head. Its eyes were hollow sockets, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, and the weeping turned to a shriek that rattled the very walls. I stumbled back, dropping the lantern, and the fire spread quickly across the rotten wood. My men scrambled to escape, and in the chaos I lost sight of them. I remember the heat, the smoke, the flames devouring the icons, and the sense that something was laughing at me from within the fire. I do not remember how I escaped. The next thing I knew, I was staggering through the snow alone, the village burning behind me. I walked for hours, perhaps days, until I was found by another German patrol. They claimed I was half mad, raving about children in shadows. My uniform singed, my face blackened with soot. When I told them what had happened, they dismissed it as hysteria brought on by exhaustion and hunger. No one believed me. No one ever does. Years have passed since then, and still I dream of that place. I hear the whispers at night, the tapping on the walls, the laughter drifting through the fog. I know what I saw, what I heard, what took my men one by one. And though the war has long ended, I sometimes wonder if the village is still there, waiting, hidden in the endless forest, its secrets buried beneath the snow. If it is, then God help anyone who stumbles upon it, for they will not leave whole. I had been in Stalingrad for 2 months when the incident happened. Though time had already lost its meaning, days and nights blended together under the constant shelling, and we lived like rats among the rubble, burrowing into cellars and basements to escape the cold and the firestorms. I was a Gefreiter then, 21 years old, and though I had seen plenty of death already, nothing prepared me for what I would encounter in that city. Our unit was assigned to secure a block of ruined buildings near the Volga, an industrial sector that had been fought over again and again until little remained but jagged walls and twisted steel. The snow covered everything in a thin, dirty layer, streaked with soot and blood, and the air stank of burnt flesh and gunpowder. We were a group of 12 men by then, the rest having been killed or scattered, and we survived by scavenging food and fuel wherever we could find it. It was during one of these scavenging missions that we came across the factory. The building loomed like a blackened skeleton against the gray sky, its windows shattered, its walls crumbling from artillery strikes. A faded Soviet banner still clung to one side, tattered and flapping weakly in the wind. We went inside cautiously, rifles ready, expecting partisans or hidden snipers, but the place was deserted. The main hall was vast and echoing, filled with rusted machinery half buried in rubble. Our boots crunched on broken glass as we spread out to search for supplies. At first, it seemed like a stroke of luck. We found crates of canned food hidden under a collapsed stairwell, still sealed, and a barrel of kerosene that would keep our fires burning for weeks. The men were ecstatic, laughing for the first time in days. But as we explored deeper into the factory, the atmosphere shifted. The light grew dimmer, the air colder, and a strange damp smell clung to the walls. My comrade Fisher swore he heard someone breathing in the shadows, though we found no one. In the far corner of the hall, behind a pile of twisted beams, we discovered a stairwell leading down. The steps descended into darkness, and a chill seemed to rise from below. Against my better judgment, I led 2 men down with a lantern. The cellar beneath was enormous, stretching farther than we expected, its walls lined with old storage rooms. The air was damp and heavy, and our lantern light flickered as though the darkness itself resisted it. Inside one of the rooms, we found something that turned our stomachs. Rows of cots lined the walls, each one holding a shriveled corpse. They looked like civilians, men, women, even children, all starved or frozen, their faces gaunt, their mouths half open as if still gasping for air. Some were huddled together in groups, their hands entwined, as if they had died clinging to one another. The stench was unbearable. One of my men vomited in the corner. We left quickly, shaken, but the images clung to us. That night, as we tried to sleep in the upper levels of the factory, I dreamed of the corpses below. I dreamed their eyes opened and followed me as I walked past, their mouths whispering words I could not understand. When I awoke, sweating, I found Fisher sitting upright, staring into the darkness. He claimed he heard footsteps moving below us, soft and deliberate, as if someone was pacing among the dead. The next day, 2 of the men refused to go near the stairwell. They insisted the air from below was foul, that it carried voices. I tried to dismiss it, but I too had begun to feel uneasy. When I stood near the stairwell, I swore I could hear faint murmuring rising from the depths, though when I strained to listen, it faded away. Over the following nights, things worsened. We heard knocking from beneath the floor, steady and rhythmic, like fists pounding on wood. Sometimes it came from the walls, sometimes from directly beneath our cots. One night, Weber screamed that someone had grabbed his ankle in the dark, though we found nothing there. Another swore he saw a shadow move across the far end of the hall, a thin, hunched figure that vanished when we shone our lanterns. The men grew restless, snapping at each other, their nerves frayed. Food no longer tasted like anything, and even the fire gave no warmth. The factory seemed to drain us, as if the very walls were watching, feeding on our fear. Some of the men wanted to leave, but the snow outside was waist deep, and Soviet patrols prowled the streets. We were trapped. Then one evening, the lanterns went out all at once. We scrambled in the dark, cursing, fumbling for matches, and when the light returned, we saw that Fisher was gone. His rifle lay where he had set it down, but he was nowhere to be found. We searched the entire building, calling his name, but there was no answer. The only place left to check was the cellar. Against every instinct, I led 3 men down the stairwell. The air was icy cold, our breath clouding in the lantern light. We moved cautiously through the rows of corpses, our boots squelching on the damp floor. That was when we heard it, a low, rasping whisper, coming from all directions at once. It grew louder as we pressed on, until it seemed the dead themselves were speaking. The men panicked, and one bolted back up the stairs, his footsteps echoing into silence. The rest of us pressed forward, driven by desperation. We found Fisher in one of the far rooms. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his eyes wide and glassy. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, as though trying to speak, but no words came. His skin was pale, his lips blue. When we tried to lift him, he screamed a shrill, animal sound that echoed through the cellar. In his panic, he clawed at us, his nails drawing blood, until we finally dragged him up into the hall. He fought us the whole way, his eyes rolling, his body convulsing. We had to tie him down to keep him from hurting himself. For hours he babbled nonsense, his words tumbling out in Russian, German, and something else I didn't recognize. Then he went silent, staring at the ceiling with a fixed grin. The others wanted to shoot him, but I forbade it. He was one of us. Yet from that night on, none of us slept soundly. The following days were a blur. One by one, the men began to unravel. Some refused to eat, muttering prayers under their breath. Others claimed to see figures standing in the doorways, watching silently. I too began to feel it. Whenever I closed my eyes, I sensed someone leaning over me, their cold breath on my face. Then came the night we lost 3 more. They had taken first watch, stationed near the stairwell, and when morning came, their rifles lay abandoned, but they were gone. No signs of struggle, no blood, nothing, just the silence of the factory pressing down on us. By now only 5 of us remained. We argued constantly, fear twisting our thoughts. Finally I decided we could not stay. Better to risk the Soviets and the snow than whatever haunted that place. We gathered what supplies we could carry, and prepared to leave at dawn. But dawn never came. The sky outside remained black, as though night refused to end. Hours passed and still the darkness lingered. The men grew frantic, pacing, shouting. Then we heard it. Footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, rising from the cellar. We froze, rifles trained on the stairwell. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just beyond the doorway. For a long moment, there was silence. Then a voice called my name. It was Fisher's voice, calm and clear. Though we had left him tied down upstairs, my blood ran cold. The others looked to me, their faces pale. Against all reason I stepped forward, lantern raised. The doorway was empty, only darkness stretching down the stairs. Yet the voice came again, closer, this time whispering my name like a lover's breath. I don't remember what happened after that. My next memory is of stumbling through the ruins of Stalingrad alone, half mad with fear and exhaustion. When I finally found another German unit, they barely recognized me. My face was gaunt, my hands trembling, my eyes hollow. I told them nothing of what had happened. Who would believe me? They said my unit had been wiped out in a Soviet ambush, and I let them believe it. It was easier than the truth, but I know what happened in that factory. I know the dead did not rest there, that something lingered in the shadows feeding on the living. Even now, decades later, I hear their whispers in my dreams, the soft knocking from beneath the floor, the voice calling my name. Sometimes I wonder if part of me never left that cellar, if I am only a shadow of the man who entered it. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I feel the cold breath on my face again. When I look back on my time in the war, most of my memories are wrapped in the same dull haze of mud, smoke, and exhaustion. Yet there is one posting I can never forget. one that has haunted me in ways the battlefield never could. It was the winter of 1943 when my unit was ordered to hold a sector in northern France. The fighting there had quieted somewhat, leaving us with the tedious duty of guarding supply routes and occupying any suitable shelter. That was how we came to live in the abandoned chateau. The place stood on the edge of a small village, perched on a slight rise with its crumbling gardens spreading into the mist. At first, we were grateful for it. Compared to the trenches and barns we had grown accustomed to, the chateau seemed almost luxurious, with its grand halls and heavy stone walls that cut the wind. Yet the villagers avoided the estate, even when coaxed by our men, muttering prayers and crossing themselves whenever we mentioned it. That should have been warning enough, but war makes men dismiss such things. We laughed and carried our rations inside. I remember my first night vividly. The building was immense, echoing with every step, its long corridors lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow us. Furniture lay under thick sheets, and cobwebs swayed in the corners. We made our camp in the servants' wing, dragging in beds and broken chairs, trying to carve some familiarity out of the decayed grandeur. But when night came, the chateau felt alive. You could hear groans in the rafters, faint rattles behind the walls as though the house was breathing in its sleep. It was a comrade named Dietrich who first claimed to have seen something. He was posted on watch in the gardens and swore he saw figures drifting among the hedges, pale shapes that moved without sound. He admitted he thought they were villagers at first, sneaking close in defiance of our presence. But when he called out, the figures simply melted into the mist. We mocked him, of course, calling him a drunk and telling him the fog played tricks. But in truth, I saw the unease in his eyes. Soldiers can endure shells and gunfire, but the unexplained always unsettles us more. Soon others began whispering. Franz said he heard music in the night, faint strains of a violin carried through the halls. Hans claimed that while on patrol near the ballroom doors, he heard laughter on the other side, muffled as though from a party. Yet when we forced the lock and pushed inside, we found only a room long surrendered to dust. Chandeliers hung with cobwebs, mirrors cracked and dull, parquet floors warped by damp. The idea that any living soul had been in there was impossible. Still, Franz insisted he heard it again on other nights, and I began to wonder if the house was mocking us. I resisted believing it for as long as I could. I told myself the men were nervous, their minds twisted by fatigue and isolation. But then came my turn on night watch. I took up my post at the edge of the gardens, wrapped in my coat, rifle across my knees. The night was unusually still, the fog heavy enough to swallow the village lights below. For hours nothing stirred. Then, near the fountain at the center of the garden, I saw them. At first I thought it was simply the mist shifting, but slowly shapes emerged. They were tall, indistinct, but undeniably human in outline. One, two, then more, moving slowly between the hedges. My heart hammered as I rose and called out in German, demanding to know who was there. None of them responded. They drifted together like dancers, circling the fountain in silence. Gathering my nerve, I walked toward them, boots crunching in the snow. Yet as I closed the distance, the figures dissolved into the fog. When I reached the fountain, nothing remained. No footprints, no disturbance in the snow, only silence pressing against my ears. I did not tell the others that night, but I could not sleep. My mind turned over the vision again and again. They had seemed too real, too deliberate in their movements to be illusions. And there was something else, something that unsettled me most. A faint glimmer in the air, like the suggestion of candlelight, which vanished when the figures did. The days stretched on, each of us more restless than the last. Small things began to happen that none of us could laugh away. Tools and rifles left in one room were found arranged neatly in another. Footsteps echoed down corridors where no one had walked. Once, while cleaning my rifle, I heard whispers in French just behind me, though I was alone. They faded as I turned, leaving me trembling with cold sweat. One evening we heard it together. A storm had blown in, rattling the shutters. and we gathered in the kitchen to escape the drafty halls. That was when the music started. At first so faint I thought it was the wind moaning through the cracks, but soon unmistakable, a violin joined by the low hum of a piano. Waltz music, sweet and sorrowful, drifting through the walls. We froze, every man staring at the ceiling as the sound swelled. With rifles ready, we followed the music down the corridor until we stood before the ballroom again. The heavy doors shuddered, as though someone danced furiously within. Our lieutenant, a hard man who despised superstition, forced them open. Silence crashed over us. The room was still and lifeless, the air thick with dust. Only the faint outline of footprints in the grime suggested anything had stirred there in decades, but even those seemed to vanish when we looked too long. After that night, discipline unraveled. Men avoided patrol duty near the gardens, refusing to be alone. Some claimed to see figures in their rooms, shadows standing at the foot of their beds until they blinked. One morning, we found Dietrich gone. His rifle leaned against the wall, his bedding untouched. We searched the grounds, the village, even the woods, but there was no trace. The lieutenant insisted he had deserted, but none of us truly believed it. The way things had been, it was easier to think the house had claimed him. I lasted only a few more weeks before we were reassigned, yet those weeks have marked me more deeply than any battle. I never again slept soundly in that place. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of shadow, set my nerves on edge. The house had a weight to it, as though it remembered every life that had passed within its walls, refusing to let them go. I began to think the chateau itself was alive, that it fed on us, waiting for us to leave more of ourselves behind. When our orders finally came, I left without looking back. Yet even now, decades later, when I hear the faint strains of a waltz on the radio, or see mist curling in the garden at dusk, I feel the same cold knot tighten in my chest, for I know what I saw that night by the fountain, and what we all heard in that ballroom. Some houses are not merely abandoned, they are inhabited by memories that never fade, by those who refuse to rest, and in that French chateau, I am certain the dead still dance.
If you liked the video, don't forget to like and share. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos like this.